Welcome to the Fundamentals of Sponsored Projects at CSU series.
In this series today, we are covering governing regulations. I am Catherine O'Hare, your moderator for today. I am a training and information coordinator here at CSU in the Office of Sponsored Programs. There will be interactive portions. Today, we will have one short breakout session. Don't panic. I'm telling you now so that your heart rate will be normal by the time it comes up. But we invite you at that time to unmute, use your screen, engage however you feel comfortable, but get to know that little small group as we discuss different parts of governing regulations. We have interactive worksheets that we've created for these sessions on the website, the OSP Fundamentals webpage. You can find worksheets for each session along with the slides if you prefer to follow along that way. But the worksheets are to engage you in a different way. To ask questions, there's a other notes section where you can put anything that you want to make sure you remember for later. There's fill in the blanks or games or videos to go check out as other resources. And it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. We have Tricia Sothergill and Kelly Rife-Stencil. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Tricia Sothergill, and I am the Senior Research Administrator in the Office of Sponsored Programs for Team 2. And just a little background, I have over 15 years experience in the research administration field. And now I will toss it to my colleague, Kelly.
Hi, I am also a Senior Research Administrator in OSP. I support Team 4. My background is short as far as research administration goes right now, but I do have quite a bit of experience with federal funding regulations. So that's where my expertise shines. Okay, so kicking it off, we're taking a look right now. This is the award lifecycle, which I think a lot of you are very familiar with. One thing that I really want to point out about this is federal and federal, state, institution governing regulations really touch pretty much every part of this process. So all these parts of the award cycle are governed in some way by federal, state, or university regulations. So it's not just award negotiation or proposal development.
So with award terms and conditions, this is a great graphic to an example is that sometimes it may appear to be something that the terms are more obvious and accessible. However, we do need to factor in all required formal guidance, which may not be very obvious with an award document. And in many cases, a one-page award letter from a sponsor will appear to be quick and easy to review when it ends up not being so. And due to complexity, policies and regulation that govern the award is that we need expert review, which is your senior research administrators and OSP is required. Our agreements, they can be very quick to negotiate, or it may be a lengthy process. One never knows. I think we all know that you tend to spend more time on something you think is going to be simple when it turns out not to be. Finding answers for award management is not always as easy as it seems, and that's why we have partners across campus to work on these projects. One item just to remember is that it is OSP's responsibility to review and approve agreements. It's not under the authority of a PI, and while a PI we may need input and discussions, is that they cannot pre-negotiate or negotiate or sign agreements.
Okay, so this is another way to kind of look at the overview that Tricia just gave. So order of precedence within award review. It goes institutional policies first. That's where we look first. Those are going to be, they're typically more restrictive and don't apply necessarily to a huge broad base. Then we go to the award terms and conditions. I think for a lot of the SRAs, this is really where we live first. This is where we start. And then sponsor terms and conditions. So these are going to be broader and perhaps cover a larger group of types of awards. And then we go to our federal regulations. So this is 2 CFR and then the FAR as well. So just a quick note, this is something that's going to show up on your worksheet if you want to take note of that right now. So for an example, right, NIH takes what's listed in 2 CFR, also known as uniform guidance, and then develops general NIH specific grants policy. So that shows up in the NIH grants policy manual, and then develops specific program guidance from there as well. So Where we have to start looking at all of these, an example is alcohol, use of alcohol in a project. It happens a fair amount at CSU actually, but let's say that uniform guidance says alcohol is not allowed, but NIH is looking for something specific related to alcohol, whether that's consumption or makeup or alcohol level, whatever. And we do need to do research on that, right? So we take a look at what NIH says about that. And then we will also take a look at what CSU says about that to make sure that we're falling within all of our necessary guidance. So just because 2 CFR says something isn't generally allowed doesn't mean that it's not specifically allowed on a certain. This also applies to marijuana, which is very apropos here in Fort Collins and definitely in Pueblo. So this is where we start having to dig in and really take a look and see what is allowed and what isn't.
So this data was very interesting and surprising to me. In one way, and then again in not another way, is that CSU sources of sponsored programs funding, we are predominantly large in NIH funding, so we are very federal heavy. And then one of the areas that we focus on federal, since it is our greatest source of sponsored programs funding per our 2021 annual report. Federal regulations have a great impact on overall university cost principles, which we need to explore more. There are sponsors that are not federal that do follow the cost principles as well. And we need to remember that we need to treat situations in like circumstances with allowability. But I found this data, I love looking at numbers, and I thought it was really interesting that funding from other higher education was at $35 million a year versus the nonprofit. I think on team 2, we must just see a lot of partners that we work with that are other universities.
All right, so let's take a few moments. I want to take a few moments and dig into uniform guidance a little bit. So uniform guidance originally, so what it did is it streamlined several of those old OMB circulars that we used to use into one guiding document. It can be found online. It is, I will warn everybody, if you're out there looking at it, it can be a little cumbersome. It's not the most user-friendly of search systems there. So if you're looking for something and run into issues, please reach out to your OSP office. We do spend a fair amount of time digging around in it. So uniform guidance covers things that covers awards that are considered assistance funding. Uniform guidance does not cover contracts, which are governed by the FAR, the Federal Acquisitions Regulations. So we have a grant, which is a type of assistance funding, as well as cooperative agreements. Grants tend to be a bit freer as far as expectations from the sponsor about how the university and the PI will work with the sponsor when conducting the project. A cooperative agreement has significant sponsor input and work being done as well. So it is much more of a cooperative thing. Types of grants are like Pell Grants. The U.S. Forest Service gives out what they call domestic grants because they also have an international branch. Cooperative agreements can kind of run the gamut, but they are always listed as a cooperative agreement. So again, Federal Code of Regulations 2 CFR is where we live. You can find it here, ecfr.gov. Again, play around in there a little bit. That website, again, is unfortunately not super easy to search for and kind of play around with, but you'll get the hang of it. And if you run into any problems, please reach out to OSP.
Just kind of a trick that I found for searching is I'll do 2 ECFR 200, and then I will put a subject matter after it. Mm-hmm. And that will help narrow down if you want to do a search online. So I found that that's been the most helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. That is a huge help. Very important tip. So 2 CFR is really what governs the assistance funding, so your grants and your cooperative agreements. You will also find this slide on your worksheets, I do believe. The subparts are really key, especially if you're trying to get an overview or looking for something pretty specific, like a definition. I've been in this one a lot. For example, a subrecipient and a vendor. Uniform guidance does lay that out pretty clearly. And so pulling that and looking at that and making sure that we are adhering to that guidance. So again, you can see there are subparts A, B, C, D, E, and F. Cost principles is also a pretty important one. This one will go into allowability, allocability, and whatnot as well.
It's everybody's favorite time. It's time for an activity. So let's discuss where we would find something. So on here, where would we find if advertising is an allowable cost? And don't be shy. Where might we find that?
It doesn't hurt to guess. This is a learning opportunity.
All right. Yes. E is in your cost principles. That is correct. Thank you, everyone. And then if you're trying to figure out how often does a program need to undergo an audit, where might we find that? Yes, F. That is correct, under audit requirements. That one was pretty easy because the word audit was in the answer. Let's see what the rest of these are. So what about the definition of participant support costs? Yep, A, another cheater because it has the word definition in it. And then number 4, what must be included in an FOA?
I don't know if we said what FOA was yet. Anyone? What's FOA?
Funding opportunity announcement.
I see some
C.
B's and C's.
Yeah, we're seeing B's and C's. We are going to say that it is C. It is under pre-award requirements. So what is it that we actually have to do in order to qualify? And then the last one, what are examples of participant support? We're going to E, cost principles would have that. And then in the chat, type in what would be a regular area for participant support. What are some ideas?
My notes say that examples of participant support are in section A, actually, because it's under the definition. But if we find it in E, I would be interested to see that.
Well, why don't we do my Google chat or my Google example
search bar.
of searching it? Let's look. Let's see what comes up.
Travel allowance to attend a conference, conference attendance, yes, for participants specifically.
Yep, not employees, correct.
Okay, so participant supports, the definition is obviously under the definitions, but also 200.456 it says, so.
400 is cost principles, right? Does it say?
Yes, yep, that's gonna be in section E, so.
Yep, between the two, we can get our definitions and examples. Sounds great. All right, you
Cool.
guys are off the hook now for a little bit of participant support, but we might, well, that sounds actual participant support in the presentation. We will loop back to that as well as, I bet we'll talk about participant support in the grant world again.
All right, so again, uniform guidance covers assistance agreements, grants, cooperative agreements, right? The FAR, however, and federal acquisition regulations, covers contracts. This is different, okay? It is very, very different. How do I want to say this?
Is it far different?
It is far different. Yes, thank you, Trisha.
It was like shooting fish in a barrel. I had to.
So FAR can sometimes be seen as much more restrictive. So if you've got a contract or you suspect that there's a contract, or if you're replying to an RFP or any other sort of request for proposal that indicates that it will move into a contract at the end, please, please, please be on the lookout for specific terms and conditions. There are some FARs that CSU has trouble accepting, and we need to know that. If you get hints of them beforehand, we do need to know that so that we can jump on that pretty quickly. Within the OSP realm, Adam Donzi is our FAR expert, and he does do the negotiations for most of our federal contracts as they come through. And that is an important thing to remember as well. The FAR applies to federal funding and federal flow-through funding. We do get a fair number of contracts that are coming from industry and or non-federal partners. So that happens as well. So the FAR will not ever have a federal assistance, a CFTA number. Grants and cooperative agreements usually do, they should, but they don't always. So something to be another cue there for you. The FAR organization, probably because I spent so much time in it in a previous life, I find much easier than the Uniform Guidance Organization. So you've got your parts 1 through 51, which is guidelines for your federal contracting officers, which is what I used to be. Part 2, or part 52, excuse me. This is your, to equate it to the uniform guidance, this is 2 CFR. This is your nitty gritty. How do I do this? What happens there? Terms, conditions, that kind of stuff. So part 53 is basic forms, and then parts 200 and on are specific agency supplements. So some agencies, again, like NIH did with the uniform guidance, federal agencies also have FAR supplements. So they take the FAR and then work up policies and procedures that work best for their own agency and their own funding. So looking at the FAR, if you go out to the website, you're going to want to, 52 is where you want to live for a while.
All right. So what are the DFARS, defense regulations? And this contains requirements of law, DoD-wide policies, delegations of FAR authority. One way to think about this, as Kelly alluded to before, is that each agency has its own grant policies and procedures. DFARS is each agency's FAR supplement. They all hold the same general theme of here's how we treat the same things like foreign acquisition, certain contracts, taxes, termination, etc. And then the DFAR should be read in conjunction with the primary set of rules in FAR, just like we have the 2 regulations to read with 2 CFR and NIH grant terms and conditions, for example. And so it really just gives that spotlight on how that particular agency is going to deal with the situations.
As far as the funding that comes into CSU, the vast majority of it that comes in are going to be grants and cooperative agreements. But we are seeing a lot more contracts, and Kelly lives in the contract realm with the team that she's on, correct, Kelly?
A little bit, yeah. We do see a lot of grants and cooperative agreements as well, but we do see federal contracts flowing through, yeah. Particularly from our big DOI sponsors. BLM loves contracts, and they love different types of contracts as well. So we do see them. Some of our state agencies really like contracts as well. Again, that's not FAR related necessarily, but Colorado Department of Transportation loves a good contract.
Yeah, where I used to see them mostly was with like labs, etc.
Yep.
So DOE in particular with their labs. But
yeah, we see some Battelle labs, your national labs. That's usually federal flow through, and so they are flowing through FAR terms. Yep.
Super quick, just another shout out. If you are working on a proposal and you have an inkling that it is going to be a federal flow through, for example, on team 2, we see some NIH contract flow through. Make sure that's noted and you let us know with the proposal review, because it can take a good bit longer, particularly if the flow through entity is not used to using a subcontract versus a sub-award. And it is a different document that we need to use, and they need to complete it because they have the knowledge of what is in their contract with the federal partner. And it can really cause some delays. And then if there's any, we don't want to have any confusion as to what something actually is as it's coming to CSU. So please let us know, make sure that's noted in the proposal. So when we get the award, we're not like, what is this? This is fun. So that we can get everything set up as quickly as possible.
One of the other things that slows us down on federal flow through contracts, we see this on the other side too, but with contracts, I see it where our sponsors, so the flow through entity, their terms are significantly more restrictive or in direct contradiction with the FAR, with the terms that they have received. And that is something that we work really hard to get out of our agreements so that we are all adhering to the same policies and regulations. All right, so a little bit beyond kind of some things to think about, particularly with the FAR. Big key takeaway for this one is most of CSU's research and work is not done under a FAR. Okay, we are far more into grants and cooperative agreements. We do some contracts, and as we discussed earlier, there are some sponsors and agencies that really rely on contracts, but it's not the norm for most of our work. Given that, it's still not a bad idea to have some exposure to FARs. You know, the FAR talks about how the government may spend money and may regulate the spending of money, but again, there are supplements. So agencies are allowed to set things like may turns into shall pretty quickly in some of those supplements. So take a look at that. If you are seeing FAR anywhere in an RFP or request for proposal, anything along those lines, please take a hard look at that and reach out to your OSP office so that we can jump on that as soon as we can, and at least have some heads up that it's coming down the pipe. One of the things we see this on both sides, but I see it on contracts quite a bit, is submission of a proposal is acceptance of terms and conditions. So if you ever see any language to that effect in an RFP, please reach out to OSP as soon as possible so that we can take a look at them. There are almost always exceptions that we want to take with those. We send a simple letter outlining what our exceptions are and what our alternative language for that clause may be. But we do see that. So please be cognizant of that so we're not agreeing to things that we can't actually agree to. So
I hadn't heard of that one before, Kelly. Thank you.
yeah, it happens a fair amount. These terms are catchers for sure. Contracts are often fixed price. So you get this work and you get this amount of money. A lot of times those are paid up front, but they are not cost reimbursable. So that's something to take a look at. Touched on it earlier as well, the difference between a sub-recipient, so a sub-awardee, and who's a vendor, that can have pretty serious budget implications. So please be aware of that definition. And if you're not sure, please reach out to your OSP team for some clarifying data on that. We also see, and this is BLM, loves things like IDIQ, which we don't like entering into, but BLM does love them. Those tend to be more service oriented rather than research oriented, and it is very much they call us when they need something and they pay us for that specific work.
IDIQ is what, Kelly?
Indefinite IDIQ, indefinite time and indefinite quantity
contracts.
Thank you. Federal contracts as well. Again, another budgeting thing to remember about this is costing, right? Let's make sure we're applying the correct IDC to those. And again, if you have any questions, reach out to your OSP team about which IDC would be most appropriate.
And we do see IDIQs on team 2 with NIH in particular. And one interesting was I just had one that reached the end of its life and they being NIH never ordered any or had any action, but they had a minimum amount that was guaranteed. So then we just get this award for $2,500. So, I mean, And the proposal, I think, was like 8 million. So yeah, it can be an adventure.
So yeah, some things to note, going down this list, FAR clauses are non-negotiable. We can, on occasion, ask for them to be removed or ask for clarification about why they apply to us, or make an argument that they don't apply to us within the context of the FAR and the work that we're doing. But for the most part, they are non-negotiable. Again, the FAR is divided into subparts, much like the uniform guidance. You'll definitely want to, if you're living in FAR world and contracts or want to know more, go out to FAR 52 and play around a little bit. So all federal acquisitions, this is purchasing. Again, these are not this is not assistance funding, must adhere to the FARs. So that's usually where we end up and that's where they end up in flow through as well, because we have to adhere to them.
All right, with this checkpoint, do we have any questions or anything you'd like to hear more information on? Oh, sounds like a no. So we'll keep trucking through. It's everyone's second favorite time of this presentation. Time for another activity. Think about a situation where an item might be allowable according to uniform guidance or the FAR, but not allowable under the program or award terms and conditions. So got that one with a little more restrictive on the program and award terms. And then rooms 4 through 6, which have the teal topic, is think of a situation where an item might not be allowable according to uniform guidance or the FAR, but is allowable under the program or award terms. And since we already talked about alcohol and marijuana, see if we can find some other topics. Let's go into the reporter. If you want to either raise your hand or start talking or just type it.
Okay, yeah, rooms 1 through 3, situations where an item might be allowable according to a federal regulation, but not allowable under a program or award.
Yeah, and Trisha and Kelly, we didn't necessarily mean to send you guys, but
Well, room 6 had a great conversation, so just say it. Yeah, so for 1 through 3, so for the beige, we have some items. Think of a situation where an item might be allowable under uniform guidance, but not allowable under program awards. Gosh, there's tons of these that can be out there. Ideas that we see down there: tuition, food, equipment, subcontracting, small business, travel, personnel salaries. Yes, F&A or indirect costs can be in there where that's allowable and then restricted by the program. While we're thinking, does 4 to 6, do you want to annotate and type some of our ideas under the teal, where a situation where an item may not be allowable under uniform guidance, but may be allowable under the program terms? All right, so we see first class travel, firearms in certain situations, recruiting costs. Yes, food that is not used as part of a study, so not for eating. All right, we've got some great ideas here.
For
You all
group
mentioned
1, computers as well.
A lifetime ago, that was one of the biggest items that I would see in budgets, is everybody wanted to buy a computer, but the institution where I was working did not allow them, and it was a hard fight. And then cell phones were the next one. Snowmobiles. I like it. That one I can,
Yeah.
All right.
Vehicles in general can be tough.
Yes. Entertainment, a great one for the 4 to 6. That's another one, definitely. These are some great ideas. All right. Well, thank you guys.
Okay, so we're going to run through a quick scenario. Here's the question. PI has come to you and has asked, is pre-award spending allowed on my DOE cooperative agreement? Where do you start? Where do you start looking at this? I start on the bottom of the pyramid and work my way up. And we are going to add another little, well, not a little, pretty important resource here, which is the NSF prior approval matrix. So that's the scenario. PI has come to you and said, is pre-award spend allowed on my DoD cooperative agreement? Where do you start? Okay, so as I noted, I would start at the uniform guidance because that's going to be your broadest. And Kat and Shannon have delightfully found the pre-award cost to CFR reference for us. So here's what pre-award costs are. Costs incurred prior to the effective date of the federal award directly pursuant to the negotiation and in anticipation of the federal award where such costs are necessary for the efficient and timely performance of the scope of work. Such costs are allowable only to the extent that they would have been allowable if incurred after the date of the federal award. A rule of thumb, if pre-award is actually allowed, is it's usually 90 days before the start of the agreement. Some agencies are very different about that. For example, Forest Service, which I do a lot with US Forest Service, they'll just give you a date. It may or may not be 90 days. It may only be 20. All right, so we'd start at uniform guidance.
And
And
Kelly, I'm just gonna say that this is part pre-award, being able to spend in pre-award is part of our expanded authorities. And this is a subject that we're gonna cover more in post-award management in our last session on the 27th. So if it's a burning question for y'all, please join us.
All right, so the end result here is the uniform guidance isn't super, there's no conclusive, right? This is basically a definition. And it says it may happen, but reading between the lines, it's going to be up to the agency essentially. Okay, so this is the new one. And I love the NSF prior approval matrix. This is a great resource. We can send you the link. NSF has compiled this prior approval matrix and it lists terms and conditions, general terms and conditions, actions that you might want, where they're listed in 2 CFR, and then what each agency, and it is not all encompassing. That is important to understand. It is not all encompassing for every federal agency, but the list of agencies that they have there, whether or not they require prior approval for that specific action. So we would take a look at this first. Well, not first, second, I would. And you'll see down here, just from the bottom, I'm pointing at my own screen. If you see my finger pop up, that's why. And it says incur project costs. There we go. Incur project costs 90 calendar days before the federal awarding agency makes the federal award. So DoD happens to be on this list, yay, and it says it is waived. Okay. So is it allowed? Is it not? It could be. We're kind of getting to maybe it could be, right? So then we move on to the next level of our pyramid. So this is program specific terms and conditions. And most federal awards contain a pre-award clause or paragraph. And right there, pre-award costs cannot be incurred prior to the selection official signing the selection statement and analysis. So if you want pre-award, if your PI in this scenario wants pre-award spending approval, we'd have to go back and ask the sponsor for that. That will typically require a justification and how much pre-award spend they might need. Federal agencies are getting much, much, much stricter about allowing pre-award. Their justifications must be pretty hefty if it's not already approved and allowed before they'll allow it. Okay, next slide. So awards often come through with special terms and conditions. They're usually a supplement to the standard terms and conditions. And so this is for EERE, which is and they're the last, well, one of our last things, right? Foreign travel costs, back to our, if it's allowed in uniform guidance, but not allowed by the specific terms. So we take a look at these as well. This is kind of just regurgitating 2 CFR pretty closely. So, yeah, so inconclusive. And then we move on to institutional policy. For pre-award spending, we don't monitor this, but OSP does not monitor this. That is a department and PI responsibility. But we do ask for what we call an at-risk spending request, which is a form I think a lot of you are familiar with. It encompasses both new at-risk, pre-award spending, and continuation at-risk spending. And that form can be found on the OSP forms website. Okay, any questions on that?
So what was our end result? We had a lot of inconclusives. We had one maybe, and we had one must request, right?
Yeah.
So what do we do with all of that?
Does anybody want to take a stab at it?
What matters the most?
I go with, and I think most of the other SRAs go with, you go with the most restrictive first conclusive, right? So your first conclusive said that it requires sponsor approval. So that's where you go.
And just to clarify, just because we have a form that says at-risk spending request, that if our sponsor says that you cannot, this doesn't supersede that.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. Unless the department wants to take those costs on.
I don't know of a department that does.
Right.
All right, so now we are kind of looping back to the beginning, to that life cycle, and what are the OSP responsibilities, and how do we fit in the award life cycle? So Kelly and I are going to kind of team hit on this one, but definitely we monitor continuous updates to sponsored agreements via modifications, ensure compliance with terms, sponsor terms and conditions, university policies, federal regulations, and requirements related to financial management of sponsored projects, as well as communicating regulatory, sponsor, and institutional policy and procedures through our website, training activities, thank you for attending, and the use of email and other electronic communications. So why is this important?
Yeah, and I just want to say, well, this probably leads into why it's important. So go ahead, Tricia.
Oh, no, I was asking you.
Okay. So this is particularly important, one, for compliance, right? It does keep us out of audit trouble and big fines. So, well, it helps keep us out of those realms. The other thing is, especially on those last two things that Tricia mentioned, the ensure compliance to sponsor terms and conditions, university policies, and the rest of that, and then communicating that out. Sponsor and federal terms and conditions, policies and regulations are constantly in flux, constantly. So just because we got an award last week from sponsor A with these terms and conditions does not mean that the award we get this week, something could have changed. So that is absolutely key to ensuring that CSU stays out of trouble, the PI stays out of trouble, the department stays out of trouble. We don't want any fines, we don't want any jail time. And it is a big part of our role to be monitoring that so that we can then communicate it out as necessary. Some of the changes are small and not something that would reach the level that we would need to send out to all of campus, but some are. So that's a big part of our role.
Yes, and some of the reasons that this is important is, like Kelly said, is just keeping us in good standing with sponsors and funding opportunities, and making sure that we're able to do that. And we can marry those strategic research goals together where not any one unit wants to be in years to come, but CSU, and then get those metrics to access change.
So takeaways we'd really, really like you guys to take away from this is be cautious. Again, don't make assumptions. Assumptions are a killer in this world. So please don't make assumptions. If you have questions about a budget or potential terms or something you're seeing in an RFP or an FOA, please reach out. We are here as a resource to help answer those questions. Our RAs are experts at reading FOAs and RFPs and distilling that stuff down to get at what the sponsor's really asking for. So please be cautious. Again, please reach out to OSP if you have any questions or concerns. And then please be patient. There's a lot of moving parts especially when we get to award stage. Well, not especially, from my viewpoint, from where I work on a daily basis. By the time we get to award stage, there's a lot of moving parts that we need to be taking into account. We are receiving funds, right? So we're already starting out sometimes at kind of off the foot for some negotiating, right? So please take some patience. We will get you the best answer we can and get things as quickly to you as we can. But we do have a lot of awards and proposals flowing through. So, questions?
Well, I had just one thought when Kelly was talking about how everybody changes all the time, like our federal sponsors and whatever, that going back to uniform guidance in particular, and I'm assuming FAR as well, even though I'm not as well versed in FAR, those documents are living documents and are constantly changing. In fact, uniform guidance goes through a really big remodel every 5 years, but it's also looked at every year, so it gets tweaked all the time. We're going through one right now, so uniform guidance is actually, we're going to have a whole bunch of changes that are coming out last we heard this spring, so we'll be in communication about that. But also our sponsors, every single year, and sometimes halfway through the year, we'll make changes. So like Kelly said, there are constantly changes. So just because something happened or was one way on an award that you had previously does not mean that it's going to go that same way. So just wanted to reiterate that, especially with us talking about uniform guidance and FAR today.
Good point. I put that link in the chat for what NCURA did for the proposed revisions discussion.
And IO has a question. Do sponsor changes immediately provoke an amendment?
So sponsor
depends.
change, yeah, it depends. Right, so sponsor changes to some terms and conditions will immediately provoke an amendment, right? Some don't. Some are pretty basic. Changes to uniform guidance or the FAR, those will often provoke an administrative mod. I see those come through a fair amount where they're adding, new or changing the language that changed in the governing regulations, and just making that clear. So it doesn't always, it kind of depends on the severity of the change, but my sponsors, at least the ones I work with on a regular basis, tend to err on the side of not issuing another mod if they can get away with it. So
I would say I've had one where a country was no longer allowed, we were no longer allowed to work with them under an executive order. And so in that case, we did have to terminate. And so it was quite a few different items had to go through and be amended. But yeah, we see a lot of administrative, they'll come as just a unilateral change. One was, it was a telecommunications item that changed, and it was just like all of a sudden we just got a flurry of mods, and it was because it had changed on the sponsor side.
Yeah, and we also see it too. Well, they will issue those mods and then they will revoke them. I've had that on a couple occasions where, let's face it, the federal government isn't super great about thinking through all possible scenarios when they change some of these regulations. And so agencies will respond to the initial change, and then there will be a lot more discussion about it, and they will realize that they need to make some changes or fully revoke the initial one. So I have had that happen several times too. Oh, never mind. We're now taking that back out. So we do try to keep an eye out for these. I mean, we keep an eye out for them. Now, again, whether or not we communicate those out, we try to communicate out the ones that are going to really impact the work or the department or the PI. A lot of these are, at least from what I've seen, a lot of these are not going to impact the PI or the department. These are, you know, the 2 CFR language changed by 2 words, but it's enough to trigger a mod, right? And it doesn't really change it, at least from a practical standpoint. I see a lot of indemnification pop back in, they leave it out, and then it comes back into the agreement, which is not something that really affects the PI or the department, so that doesn't usually get sent out.
And a lot of the sponsor, like PAP guide, like from NSF and for the policy guide for NIH, they'll give the time period when it's going to be in effect. So for instance, all the PAP guide changes aren't going into effect until May. So we will be sending out announcements about some of those PAP guide changes, but those will be on proposals then done from that day in May that they have onward. And also then for the awards for those. So yes, we are keeping an eye out and an ear out and a leg and an arm and everything else.
I was remembering that when I used to manage Simmons Foundation, they would send an annual email saying terms and conditions have been updated. And sometimes they would send it to only the person who submitted the proposal or the PI and not notify everyone. And then we'd have to see if it did change the award agreement and have to create our own internal modification based off that email. So if something does come to you and you want to check that your whole team knows, communicate it out.
Yes, I'd rather get the information 4 times than not get it at all and have a problem later on down the road. Same if you receive an award, just forward it over and we'll take care of it. I'd rather see it multiple times than 0 times.
No. Special thank you to our presenters for sharing their expertise today. Thank you, Tricia. Thank you, Kelly. On behalf of our OSP Training and Professional Development Committee, thank you for your participation in today's training session. Have a good day.
Thank you for coming, everyone.